As the race for the White House remains dead even, many business leaders and CEOs are avoiding saying who they're publicly supporting. While some have donated millions to the candidates or political action committees, a lot have decided it is just not worth speaking out. But one person who's been very public about his support for VP Harris is Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn. He joins me now. Reid, it is great to talk to you again. You are one of VP Harris's most public supporters, yet you're one of the few. And right now, a lot of folks are saying, why aren't business leaders speaking out? But others argue they're the CEO of a company. It's not their role to. Where do you come out on this?
Well, I think you have to be careful about what you speak out for as a business leader. I think that, for example, this is an election that I think business leaders could speak out for, because the notion of a stable rule of law, a kind of a unifying influence, kind of a how do we build things versus how do we have, witch hunts for enemies within and other kinds of things are actually, in fact, important business topics. And they're not partisan. They are American. I think a lot of business leaders are not speaking out because of clear, threats of retaliation. In particular, we already saw President Trump when he was in office, doing things around Amazon and other kinds of things where he would essentially attack the individuals and the companies that he viewed to be in political opposition, which is, of course, the kind of thing we should stand against as Americans.
To that very point, he raised the postage prices that hurt Amazon when Trump was president last time. So when Jeff Bezos decides now, kind of at the 11th hour, not to have the Washington Post weigh in and endorse something they have done for years, does that give other business leaders a free pass to sit this one out? And if they're willing to basically fold, what does that mean for the average person who's afraid of what a Trump presidency could mean?
Well, it's precisely when you have some power and position is when you should essentially stand up and speak. It's like when you feel fear, the stakes are important, because what we are essentially arguing for is the ability to have our American democracy, which is freedom of speech, discourse, learning, and a peaceful transition of power, which, for example, former President Trump has never agreed to, right? I mean, he's literally said things like, I'm only going to agree to a peaceful transition of power if I win.
But
right?
Here's what I don't get. I understand that it's kind of this calculation on their part, like tariffs are coming, they don't want to get hit, they want to get a waiver, so you better stay on the right side of him. But if he chooses to be the dictator-like leader that he says he's going to be, cozying up to him now might not make a difference. He could seek vengeance over anything at any time. Wouldn't they know better? That's short-sighted and foolhardy?
Well, you'd hope so, but it is a common thing in human experience, and, everybody, including CEOs, is human, say, oh, that'll happen to someone else, not to me, right, is kind of the classic thing that happens. It's one of the reasons why, like within business, too rarely do people do reference checks, because they, that person may have been really bad over here, but they'll be fine with me. And you're like, no, not necessarily. You should actually, in fact, take the references, take the history, take what all of essentially, Trump's key people like John Kelly, who is his longest serving chief of staff, say about him, and use that as a referential information to know exactly what you're getting.
Sure, it's human nature to do that, but then I just think about Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney, who basically gave up their careers, Shay Moss, Ruby Freeman, who live in fear because they stood up for democracy. I want to ask you about Elon Musk. The last time we spoke, he was backing Trump, but now he is all in. He may take a role or an unofficial role in a Trump presidency. What do you think about this? And how much influence does he have, not just with his money in Trump's campaign, but controlling Twitter, what that information or misinformation does in terms of how people are feeling or what they're thinking about these campaigns?
Well, the unfortunate truth is, obviously, entrepreneurial, Elon is a huge hero with Tesla, with SpaceX, having done a number of different things. I wish he would stay with that, because with Twitter, What he's essentially ended up doing is retweeting many conspiracy theories. I think there was an NBC report of some sort that showed he was the primary retweeter of Russian Times information. Then we see the Wall Street Journal saying he's having secret meetings with Putin, who was obviously a destructive force in the world, not just in Ukraine. And so, I think, the obvious question is, how much is he thinking about it as a commercial advantage? SpaceX, deeply tied to the government, Tesla, auto regulations, Twitter, X, with the kind of media thing, and how much has he, been captured by misinformation himself? I think that's an unknown, kind of thing, but I think it's an enormously corrosive force.
I sure do. He's not the only one I want to ask you about. Peter Thiel, someone you have known for years and years. You were schoolmates. He obviously has been very, very supportive of J.D. Vance. He's practically created his political career. He's the main investor in one of the biggest prediction markets out there, Polymarket, where people can bet on who wins the presidential election. President Trump has been getting stronger and stronger in these betting markets. It's causing a big stir in definitely people in New York, definitely people on Wall Street are hearing about it. But now they have been accused of manipulation. What are your thoughts on this? Well,
I think there have been some pretty good analyses. Chaos Labs, Inca Digital has shown that there's a lot of wash trading on Polymarket, which is essentially an attempt to manipulate what it looks like by trading at high volume. So, it's a natural thing if you're going to, kind of lie about elections, lie about the 2020 being a stolen election and everything else, to also go engage in, a form of, image fraud by, whoever is engaging, because all it takes is some money to kind of unbalance the betting markets. And, that's what I think what we're seeing there. And I think we've gotten some pretty good analysis of it. I haven't done the analysis myself.
Image fraud that could end up depressing the vote because people think, oh, well, I guess Trump's going to win it. Or it will give Trump a path to claim the election was stolen or it was rigged if he doesn't win. So then given, and I know you haven't done analysis on that, but you're doing a lot of analysis and research, where do you think this race is right now?
So I think the race is actually, in fact, quite close. I think there's a set of different, kind of polls that are within margin of error. Obviously, I am a strong believer in why I think, Vice President Harris is the best for the unity of the country and also the business of the country. But I think that we're, it's neck and neck in the battlefield states.
All right, then, Reed, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining me tonight.
My pleasure.